Morning, Happy New Year, New Year. I'm Yuval, and today we'll be focusing on flow metrics and how they're different or similar and complementary across different frameworks. I get a lot of questions and see a lot of commentary in the different Agile communities about uh, why did SAFe come up with its own flow metrics? Where do those names flow time and um, flow load come from? Why aren't we just using scaled Agile, not just using the flow metrics that we're familiar with in the professional Scrum community, in the Kanban community? Even in the Kanban community, there are different perspectives on these flow metrics. So what I thought I'll do is share my perspective on these different flow metric taxonomies and how do they relate. So let's dive right in. And as we go, I'm looking forward to your questions and comments, whether you're on LinkedIn or YouTube or Facebook. So I want to start with the Kanban guide for Scrum teams flow metrics. That's a set of metrics that I was actually part of co-creating. These metrics, there are 4 metrics in the Kanban guide for Scrum teams. Cycle time, which is the flow metric to rule them all. If you want to choose one, that's the one that you should be focusing on. And I would say, 50 to 70% of your focus on transparency, understanding, improvement should be focused on cycle time, whether you call that cycle time or a different name. The next metric is throughput. If cycle time focuses on the time it takes you to process, to deliver value end to end, or in a subsection of the process, throughput talks about the amount of things that you can finish in a time period. And the difference between that and the classic metric of velocity is that in throughput, we don't care about the size of things, we just count them. So instead of a sum function, it's more of a count function. Then the third metric is work in process, the amount of things that you had in your process at each point in time. And we piece 2 things. It's both how many things do you currently have in your process, so you can look at that as a point in time view, but also over time, how many things were in the process. And we know that there's this relationship between the amount of work in process that you have and your cycle time and your throughput. The fewer things you have in process, the faster your cycle time will be. And also that if you are managing to work effectively on a smaller set of things, actually your throughput will improve because you're reducing the amount of context switching waste that you have in your system. The last metric that we include that's, I would say, not a classic Kanban metric. I mean, cycle time, throughput, work in process, those are classic Kanban metrics. We didn't come up with them in the Kanban guide for Scrum teams. We just documented them and brought them into the professional Scrum world. But the work item aging metric didn't exist as a formal metric before, or wasn't that commonly used. And the work item aging is basically an opportunity to look at items that are still in the system that haven't finished yet, and look for items that are aging more than others, with the intent to focus on these items and help them flow so that they don't become items that have a very anomalous cycle time. So you want to look for these items that are at risk of becoming a very long cycle time items. So those are the four metrics in the Kanban guide for Scrum teams. Let's take a look at how they map to what SAFe is talking about. So first of all, to understand the SAFe flow metrics, you need to understand the context. SAFe's flow metrics are actually coming from Mick Kirsten's work. Mick Kirsten, the head of TaskStop, wrote Project to Product, and introduced flow metrics at a higher level than we typically talk about. Those are not necessarily flow metrics for teams. Those are flow metrics for organizations, for leaders that are looking to hopefully manage their portfolio of products more like products and less like projects. And Mick has done very important work in bringing this vocabulary of flow to areas which weren't prone to it or privy to it yet at the time. And Mick talked about 4 flow metrics. Those are the 4 green ones here: flow time, flow velocity, flow load, and flow efficiency. And he suggested measuring those things at the entire value stream level of your product and across products. And we also recommend doing that with the Scrum with Kanban metrics, even though the focus of the Kanban guide for Scrum teams is more at the team level. But the metrics are the same. And one of the important things in this world is you can leverage similar metrics you can and should leverage those metrics at multiple levels of the organization. So what you might call multiple flight levels, if you're a fan of that, of Klaus's flight levels framework. So to map between the basic flow framework metrics that Mick suggests and the Kanban guide for Scrum teams, the mapping is pretty easy, to be honest. So if we look at flow time maps to cycle time. And both for Mick and for the professional Scrum with Kanban world, we want to both look at the end-to-end flow time as well as the time in subsections. For example, we are interested both in overall time, what we sometimes call lead time. How long does it take us from the moment we recognize the need to the moment that we can actually satisfy that need? But it's also interesting to take a look at how much time does it take us from the actual moment that we start working on something after the upstream, and how long does it take us until we're ready to release it? How long does it take the downstream activity, what the DORA metrics look at, from finishing something to deploying and releasing it? These are subsections of the value stream that we want to pay attention to. Both flow time and cycle time talk about that, talk about looking at the end-to-end as well as deciding which subsections you want to focus on. And when we work with organizations, we help them understand which flow times or cycle times they want to pay attention to. Maybe start with end-to-end, maybe start with just the actual cycle time from the moment you start on something, and then pay attention to the upstream or downstream work. Flow velocity and throughput are kind of similar. There's this option when you look at flow velocity to actually do the more classic Scrum velocity, which includes sizing items. But that's not a must, and our recommendation is to not worry about that too much and focus mainly on the throughput. If you look even at SAFe's definition of the flow velocity, it's the number of completed work items over a time period, not the size of those items. So we're seeing change towards more of a throughput-oriented focus when we talk about flow from the classic velocity world. Flow load is basically work in process. There's no real difference there. And you can kind of see how these taxonomies are mappable one to the other. Where it gets interesting is flow efficiency. Flow efficiency is not something that Meek, invented. David Anderson talked about flow efficiency forever, but flow efficiency has always been hard to actually measure. In order to measure flow efficiency, which basically talks about how much time is the work actually moving or being value added, or we're doing something that adds value to the work, and how much time is the work either in rework or being delayed or doesn't move. In order to really do that, you need to have a value stream or a Kanban workflow definition that clearly identifies what states are value add or moving, what states are queues or non-value add. That's a good idea in general, but it also requires accuracy in when people are moving items in between these stages. So getting to the point that your actual flow efficiency is measured in your flow metrics is non-trivial, and we typically recommend going to that type of flow metric when you have a little bit more maturity. Maybe you want to set up your workflow in order to support that, and that's something I recommend, but I wouldn't necessarily focus on measuring and improving flow efficiency from day one. Work item aging in the professional Scrum with Kanban metrics doesn't really have direct mapping in SAFe's flow metrics. That doesn't mean you shouldn't use those. You shouldn't use work item aging in some way when you're using SAFe and the flow framework. Jeff asks a question about flow predictability, which I'm getting to in a bit. And we'll take a look at flow predictability at the team level. Happy to do that. All right. So those were the 4 flow metrics that come directly from Meek's flow framework. But SAFe added a couple of other flow metrics. I'm actually going to start with flow distribution, and then we'll get to flow predictability. Flow distribution is basically the proportion of work items by different types in a system. This relates to capacity allocation. So what we're interested to see here is if we have different types of work that are flowing, let's say new features, technical debt reduction, fixing defects. Maybe we want to look at work that is Horizon 1, cash cow kind of work versus work that is future-oriented, Horizon 3, whatever segmentation we wanna have, we can map that segmentation to item types in our definition of workflow, and through flow distribution, we can see how many of these items do we have in the system. Now, what's not explicit in the definition here, and you need to think about, is what are we looking at? Are we looking at breaking down flow load by different items? So, for example, if we have 10 items that were in process at a certain point in time, how many of these items were new features? How many items were enablers? How many of these items were defects? How many of these items were technical debt reduction? Another way to look at it is to actually look at flow velocity. So if we finish 10 items, in the last iteration, sprint, PI, whatever, how many of these items that we finished were of these different kinds. And what I recommend is looking at both, and it might be interesting to see the relationship. Are we at least pulling into our system in a distribution that is aligned with our capacity allocation? Are we finishing? And is there some interesting relationship? So, for example, we might be pulling in technical debt work, but that technical debt work might not be finishing at a rate that is similar to the other pieces. That might be some interesting insight. As you can see, again, in this definition, it talks about in the system, but it doesn't explicitly talk about is it finished in the system or in the load of the system. So that's something you need to pay attention to. Flow distribution is not discussed directly in the professional Scrum with Kanban metrics, but it's a good idea to take a look at that. One of the interesting things it does relate to is the innovation rate, the ability to innovation rate that we talk about in evidence-based management, which I'm going to take a look at later on. But generally, we want to take a look at our innovation efforts, our capacity. How is it dedicated to different things, to maybe different versions, to maybe working towards innovation versus supporting existing things, doing some rework, fixing quality problems from earlier. Flow distribution can help us understand these different things and have some evidence about how effectively we're working. How much of the work is directed towards where we want it to be is another interesting direction. We have this concept of a guardrail. Guardrails in SAFe, capacity allocation is one of those guardrails. Horizons is another guardrail. Flow distribution can help us understand whether our actual work is aligned with the guardrails, with the policies that we set to ourselves. We can see guardrails as policies or workflow policies in the world of the Kanban guide for Scrum teams. That's another comparable concept. So that leaves us with flow predictability, which is a weird metric, if we're honest about it, because it doesn't have anything to do with flow. Flow predictability talks about how consistently we are at achieving our objective. This text here talks about meeting our commitments. The important piece here is that it's commitments to achieve value. The way we measure flow predictability in SAFe, and we have nothing like that directly in the Kanban guide for Scrum teams or in other flow metrics approaches, is we take a look at what are the objectives that a team or a team of teams, ART, sets to themselves at the beginning of a PI, a time period, based on their understanding of their capacity. And at the end of that time period, we take a look at how much they've been actually able to accomplish, and we can compare notes on whether we're able to actually predict our ability to deliver value. And here it's about delivering value. It's not about throughput. We're not measuring the amount of stuff that we were able to deliver. We're measuring our ability to actually hit our objectives. So maybe in order to answer the question in a bit more depth, let me actually look at an article that I wrote about this. Just a second. Bear with me. All right. So let me And so at the class several years ago, somebody asked about this notion of the flow predictability. Somebody in an implementing safe class asked about this notion. Um, well, again, what are we saying here? We're saying that at the beginning of a time period, the beginning of a PI, which is a set of iterations, a team and aggregating across teams and art sets objectives to themselves based on their understanding of what they're able to achieve. And they have a conversation with their stakeholders, their business stakeholders, about the business value that this would provide. The important thing here is that this is a conversation in between the team and its stakeholders about value delivery. Now, at the end of the PI, we look at what's the increment that this team created. We look at the PI system demo, and we ask the same business stakeholders what are their thoughts. And this is how we calculate flow predictability. We compare the aggregate planned business value across objectives and the actual business value across objectives. And, we get to some number, some percentage, like 85%, 60%, 50%. It's very common for teams that are just starting to basically get a very low flow predictability. Mainly because of the actual low predictability of flow velocity for starters. But even after those teams manage to stabilize their flow velocity, let's say their throughput, they might also have an issue with flow predictability because they might be having some misunderstandings of where value is. They might be delivering output but not delivering outcomes. And this is where I see flow predictability being a good step forward towards paying attention to evidence around, are we delivering value? Are we delivering outcomes? But it's not necessarily good enough. Or we could do better. We could do better than that. How could we do better than that? Share the tab again. How could we do better than that? We could start to pay attention to outcomes. So flow predictability is in the, I would say, in the space between output, think velocity or throughput. Both velocity and throughput are still output. It's not about outcomes. Are we actually delivering something useful? Are people actually using it? Flow predictability starts to ask questions around, is this useful? Are we getting business value out of it? It's not perfect because typically it's talking still about, do we think we're getting business value? Because we don't necessarily have the full evidence. That's why I wrote that article about actual business value. Talked about it in a SAFE Summit. The fact that in order to really close the feedback loop, you need to wait some time. You need to actually get this to production, measure how it's actually used, and then you know if you've delivered outcomes. But this is also the space where it makes sense to start to look at the bigger picture. Flow metrics really do one important thing. They improve your ability to innovate and get to market. It by creating flow, you're enabling yourselves to improve outcomes, because flow creates feedback loops. If you look at Gene Kim's ways towards DevOps, he talks about the fact that you need to establish this feedback loop and you need to accelerate it. This is what flow is about. Creating and accelerating the feedback loop. That feedback loop by itself doesn't improve the value that you create. You can still build shitty stuff. You can still waste a lot of time building the wrong things. But if you establish a good flow with real feedback at the end, you will know earlier and have better understanding of the quality and the value and the outcomes from what you're building. And that feedback can actually support starting to focus on more valuable things. And that's what both evidence-based management in the Scrum.org world, as well as the outcomes focus through OKRs in the SAFe world focus on. And maybe it's for another time, but very high level, what we can see is that if we look at both these frameworks, evidence-based management talks about 4 key value areas. Ability to innovate and time to market are the ones that relate to flow and your capability to create value. Current value and unrealized value with things like customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, usage of the product and its features, and unrealized value in terms of gap in market share or potential addressable market share that you're not yet, that you haven't yet captured, and customer satisfaction gaps, things that you understand people would like to do differently with your product that you can do something about. Those are in the outcomes space. Flow metrics don't have anything to do with that level, but if your flow metrics are good, you improve your capability to create outcomes. Similarly, in the SAFe world, flow metrics talks about the ability to develop and deliver and innovate in the development value stream. And that needs to be balanced with, are we actually improving outcomes? Are we maintaining a healthy business through focusing on KPIs? Are we achieving our strategic disruptions through OKRs, objectives and key results? And SAFe adds another aspect to its measure and grow focus, which is competency, which is basically assessing our skills and our maturity, our competency at each one of the aspects that are needed in order to do these different things. It's basically another way to think about how do we improve flow. Beyond just focusing on the flow metrics, here are some concrete ideas that can help us improve flow. Like, for example, let's set up agile teams. Let's set up agile teams of teams. Let's implement lean compliance. Let's implement lean portfolio management. So those are concrete steps that we could take to actually improve our competency that will improve flow and enable us to actually achieve better outcomes. Going back to the Scrum.org world, you could say that evidence-based management focuses on outcomes and flow. The competencies come from things like Scrum, Nexus, professional product ownership, professional Scrum mastery, professional agile leadership. There are different competency skills and capabilities in the Scrum.org world as well. So you can compare and contrast it. I want to get back to some questions. Jeff has a couple of other ones here. So, is there a recommended flow predictability measure at the sprint or iteration level? I know at PI level, we have team PI objectives. So I typically just focus on the PI objectives, even at the sprint and iteration level. But what I recommend doing is not waiting until the end of the PI to take a look at those PI objectives. So that's maybe a good segue to one other thing that I wanted to mention here, which is how to use these flow metrics in agile events. And this sort of chart in the professional Scrum with Kanban world came about as an exercise during one of the early professional Scrum with Kanban classes, and it's now documented in the class and in a popular blog article that is linked here. By the way, I'll share this mural with everybody so that you have access to all of the links. And then recently, I created a similar mapping that looks at flow metrics and the safe events and how to use these flow metrics in the different safe events. That was popular and controversial because everything safe is controversial when you go to LinkedIn. But I think it's a useful thing to look at. So to talk about flow predictability, if we go to that table, let's take a look at the team level. This is for the team level. The other one is for the art. The metric of flow predictability. Here are some suggestions of how to use that metric during your iteration. So for example, go back to sharing screen. So for example, in iteration planning, you want to look at your PI objectives. You don't need to you are creating iteration goals. That's flow predictability, something related to flow predictability at the iteration level. But you want to connect it to your PI objectives. You want to understand where are you standing on these objectives. In the daily Scrum, I wouldn't worry too much about the PI objective, but you want to look at your iteration goal that hopefully relates to that. In the iteration review, you look at the iteration goal, but then you inspect progress towards the PI objectives and maintain that connection between the two. So those are just some examples of how to connect to flow predictability at the team level. And I made some mess, of course. Clean it up a bit. If you look at the art level, flow predictability, here are some suggestions of how to actually work on flow predictability during the PI. So not just in the PI system demo, for example, but also in the system demo, you want to inspect the progress towards this. So next question was a link to the article. I shared it as a comment here, and I'll also share it later. Shivam has a question. Which metrics we can use in the team sync meeting? So going back to this table over here, if we are looking at it from a safe perspective, here are my suggestions. So in the team sync, I wouldn't worry about flow time or throughput. Those are lagging indicators. We don't have them in the team sync or daily Scrum, but we want to look at the current working process. not necessarily the metric of work in process over time or flow load over time, but what's currently going on. And just look at your Kanban board. You don't need much more than that, and address excessive load. You want to reflect on the current distribution of work in progress and whether it requires an intervention. Do we have too many, technical debt, quality things? Is it aligned with our capacity allocation? That's something I recommend doing in the Team Sync Daily Scrum. Just to clarify, we're talking about, this column over here. And we also want to pay attention to our iteration goals, maybe have a quick conversation about PI objectives, but typically it would be about the iteration goal, not necessarily the PI objective. And definitely take a look at your work item aging. Look for items that are stagnant, stale, haven't been moving, started a while ago on your Kanban board, especially if you're the sort of team that has items that are flowing across iterations that you started in earlier, that you don't finish all of the items that you start in an iteration. If you have that pattern, it's especially important to take a look at work item aging. All right. Any other questions from Jeff, Shivam, or anybody else that's still with us? So in the next, while we're waiting for questions, I want to talk about some of the next topics I want to focus on. So one specific topic I want to dive into is how to actually work with these flow metrics in tools. So for example, in JIRA, what metrics to look at the different layers, the metric for the art level, the metrics for the team level, how to use Epic level Kanban boards, how to use either the Scrum or Kanban boards in JIRA, and how they enable looking at the different flow metrics, what exists within JIRA, what requires some plugins from this set of flow metrics. I've done some work, a lot of work last year with a couple of clients on this that there's some opportunity to share from. The other interesting area to look at is how does EBM, evidence-based management, map to SAFe beyond the flow metrics, how to map the ideas of EBM and the metrics of EBM to the skeletal agile framework world, and how you could actually improve your SAFe implementation by using these EBM metrics. The other topic I'm going to talk about, and there's one scheduled next week. Take a look at the events that are planned. Is the OKR's Kanban. So the OKR Kanban board is one topic that I have some interesting thoughts that I want to share, going beyond the fixing OKRs, reducing OKR work in process live stream from earlier on. And there's a fixing your OKRs worksheet that I can give you a preview to here. That aggregates, some tools and thinking processes from the different fixing OKRs streams that, at some point I'll be able to share and can actually use to bring in your OKRs and do some exercises around improving them. So I'm going to go over what's there right now and hopefully get some feedback so that I can improve it and share it later on. So those are the upcoming LinkedIn Live events that are scheduled, as well as some other ones that I'm thinking of. Hopefully this is useful. Let's continue the conversation in the comments. This will be available as a recording on LinkedIn as well as YouTube. I'll see you next time. Meanwhile, let the work flow. Keep the spice flowing. Have a great day. Bye-bye.